You are not who you think you are. According to one of the most rigorous philosophical systems ever assembled, the person you call I does not exist as a single lasting thing. And yet something is reading these words right now. Something is curious. Something is a little uneasy. So what is it, if not you? Over the next 2 hours, we are going to do something most people spend their whole lives carefully avoiding. We are going to take the human mind apart, piece by piece, the way a careful technician takes apart a watch. Not to destroy it, but to understand why it ticks, and to find out whether there is anyone actually inside it. Ancient Indian monks did this work over centuries, with a precision that would make a modern psychologist nervous. They ended up with a list. 75 items. No soul on the list. No self on the list. Just process after process. This is the Abhidharma, the Buddhist science of mind. Buried inside it is a question that sits exactly on the line between good and evil, between comfort and despair. If there is no permanent you, who is responsible for what you do? Who suffers? Who, if anyone, gets reborn? By the end of this video, you will understand why this question genuinely terrified some of Buddhism's own philosophers, why a Scottish skeptic and a 20th century Oxford philosopher arrived at disturbingly similar conclusions from a completely different direction, why modern neuroscience keeps bumping into the same wall, and why letting go of I might be the most practical idea in the history of thought, rather than a mystical slogan. This video is built for slow listening. Let it play while your eyes close, while your mind drifts in and out, because some of these paradoxes work best when they are absorbed rather than chased. There is no test at the end. Just sit with it, half awake if you like, and let the ideas settle the way sediment settles in still water. Before we begin, if this kind of slow, careful philosophy is useful to you, a like and a subscription genuinely helps this channel keep going. My words are nothing without those who say thank you for them. And one more thing, we are always looking for the next mind to take apart. If there is a school of philosophy or a thinker you want examined this way, American, Indian, European, Russian, British, German, or a concept from psychology that keeps bothering you at 3 in the morning, leave a short comment with the topic. We read them. Now, let's go looking for the self. And let's see what we find when we cannot find it. Here is a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Who are you? Not your name? Not your job? Not your face in the mirror this morning? Those are labels stuck onto something. But what is the something? Most people, asked to point at themselves, end up pointing at their chest, near the heart, as if there is a small operator sitting in there, behind the eyes, watching the show, making the decisions, feeling the feelings. We call this operator I. We assume it has been there since childhood, that it will still be there tomorrow, that it is the one thing about us that does not change while everything else does. Around 25 centuries ago, in northern India, a group of thinkers decided to test that assumption the way a scientist tests a hypothesis. Not with faith, not with poetry, with analysis, category by category, until nothing was left unexamined. They were the Abhidharmikas, literally, those devoted to the deeper teaching, the ones who go beyond the surface and into the heart of the matter. Their question was almost embarrassingly direct. When you look closely enough at a human being, can you actually locate this I anywhere? If you have realized you are riding a dead horse, the wise thing is to get off, and the Abhidharmikas treated the common-sense self exactly like a dead horse. Not because they hated the idea of a person, but because the harder they looked for a single, solid, unchanging self, the more it dissolved into a list of separate events, happening one after another, very fast, creating the impression of someone watching. This is not nihilism. The Buddha was famously impatient with people who jumped from there is no permanent self to therefore nothing exists and nothing matters. He called that the other extreme, just as mistaken as believing in an eternal soul. The actual claim is narrower and in some ways more unsettling. There is experience, there is process, there is cause and effect, but there is no single owner sitting behind it all. directing the show. Try this for a moment, the way a Harvard lecture hall gets handed a trolley problem and asked to choose. Imagine the version of you that existed at 5 years old. Different body, different thoughts, different fears, almost no memories in common with you now except a few fragments. Now imagine the version of you that will exist in 50 years, if you are fortunate enough to get there. Different body again, different concerns, possibly different opinions about things you currently consider unshakable truths. What exactly connects these three people across half a century? Not atoms. Every atom in your body is replaced many times over a lifetime. Not memory. Most of it is already gone. And what remains is reconstructed, not replayed, every time you recall it. Not personality. Ask anyone who has gone through a divorce, a serious illness, or genuine grief, and they will tell you they are not the person they used to be. And they will mean it literally, not poetically. So what is left? The Abhidharma's answer is unsettling in its simplicity. Nothing is left, in the sense of a single continuous thing. What is left is a chain. Each link causes the next link. The chain feels continuous the way a film feels continuous, even though it is actually thousands of separate still frames flashed in rapid succession. You do not see the gaps between frames. You see motion. You do not see the gaps between mental events. You see a self. This doctrine is called anatta, or anatman, not self, no self. It is one of the three marks of existence in early Buddhism, alongside impermanence and suffering, and it is arguably the most radical metaphysical claim any major religious or philosophical tradition has made about the nature of the person. Not, yourself is hidden, or yourself is divine and eternal, which is what most religious systems say. Instead, there was never a fixed self there to begin with. What you have been calling I your entire life is a label glued onto water that is never, even for one instant, the same water twice. And here is where the question on the edge of good and evil starts to surface. The question this whole video circles back to again and again. If there is no fixed self committing the act, who is morally responsible when something terrible happens? If there is no fixed self enduring the pain, does suffering even matter the way we assume it does? The Abhidharmikas were not asking these questions to be clever. They were asking because the answers determine how you should live, how you should judge yourself, how you should treat people who wrong you, and what, if anything, continues after you die. We are going to take this apart piece by piece. Chariot first, then the person, then the 75 fundamental building blocks the tradition eventually settled on, then the historical battles between the schools that built and contested that list, then the surprising company this ancient claim keeps among modern Western philosophers and neuroscientists who arrived at strikingly similar conclusions without ever reading a word of Sanskrit. Each piece reveals something a little more uncomfortable than the last. But there is a reason to keep going, and it is not despair. It is closer to relief, because if the thing you have spent your whole life protecting, defending and worrying about does not exist the way you think it does, then a great deal of suffering may simply be optional. We will get there. First, we need to meet a king, a monk, and a chariot that quietly destroyed an entire worldview in about 10 sentences. There is a conversation recorded in the Pali Canon in a text called the Milinda Panha, The Questions of King Milinda, that does more philosophical work in a few short exchanges than most modern books manage in 300 pages. King Milinda, almost certainly the Greco-Bactrian King Menander, ruling a Hellenistic kingdom in what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, a genuinely remarkable historical detail, Greek philosophy and Buddhist philosophy meeting face to face on the same carpet, summons a monk named Nagasena and challenges him. The king wants to know who exactly he is talking to. What is this, Nagasena? Nagasena turns the question back on him, using an object sitting right there in front of them both. The king's own chariot. Is the chariot the wheels? Nagasena asks. No, says the king. The wheels are not the chariot. Remove a wheel and the chariot broken is still recognizably a chariot thing, just not a working one. Is it the axle then? No. The frame? No. The yoke, the reins, the goad. No, no, no. Piece by piece, Nagasena strips away every component, and at every step the king has to admit that no single piece is the chariot. But when Nagasena puts the question the other way, is the chariot then all the pieces combined sitting in a useless pile on the ground? The king has to admit that is not right either. A pile of disassembled parts is not a chariot. A chariot is what happens when those parts are arranged a particular way, functioning together, doing chariot things. Rolling, carrying, turning. The word chariot, Nagasena concludes, is a convenient label for a particular arrangement and function of parts. It is real in the sense that the label is useful, and the function is real, but it does not point to some extra, hidden essential chariotness floating somewhere behind or within the parts. There is no soul of the chariot waiting inside the wheels. And then comes the move that makes this conversation famous, rather than merely clever. Nagasena applies exactly the same logic to himself, to Nagasena, to the king, to every human being who has ever lived. The name Nagasena is a convenient label for a particular, temporary functioning arrangement of physical and mental processes. There is no extra hidden Nagasenaness sitting behind the processes, watching them, owning them. There is no soul of the person waiting inside the body. Notice what this argument does not say. It does not say Nagasena is an illusion in the sense of being nothing at all. He is clearly sitting there, talking, breathing, making excellent arguments. It says the kind of thing he is has been misidentified. We assumed a person was a single, simple, indivisible essence, wearing a body like a coat. The chariot argument suggests a person is instead a complex, composite functioning process, real as a process but with no single essential core hiding inside it. This is worth sitting with, because it is the hinge the entire Abhidharma tradition swings on. An enemy is not always an enemy and a friend is not always a friend, the old saying goes. And in the same way, a self is not always quite what it presents itself as. The label survives. The function survives. What does not survive close inspection is the assumption that underneath the label there must be one solid thing. This argument did not stay confined to one dialogue. It became the template the entire later tradition reused on every possible target. Nations, families, rivers, mountains, and eventually the 75 basic factors themselves, which is exactly the territory the next several chapters walk through. But it is worth pausing here to notice how unusual it is historically that this particular argument survives at all in the form it does. A record of a Greek-descended king, ruling territory Alexander's army had passed through 2 centuries earlier, sitting down with a Buddhist monk and getting intellectually dismantled in real time. Whatever else this text is, it is a reminder that the ancient world was far more philosophically interconnected than the usual textbook division into separate sealed-off Western and Eastern traditions suggests. Here is the discomfort this chapter is supposed to leave you with, because that is the whole point of this channel, sitting on the line between comfort and unease rather than handing you easy answers. If Nagasena is just a useful label for a process with no essential core, then so is the version of you sitting here right now, listening to this. The name you respond to at a party, the face in your passport photo, the history you tell about yourself when someone asks who you are, all of it, convenient labels for an arrangement of parts in motion. The question that follows naturally is which parts? The Abhidharma tradition's answer begins with a famous list of 5. A list so old it predates the formal Abhidharma texts and goes straight back to the Buddha's earliest recorded teaching. If a person is not a single self wearing a body, what is a person made of? The earliest Buddhist texts answer with a list called the 5 skandhas, often translated as the 5 aggregates or, more vividly, the 5 heaps. The first heap is form, rupa. This is the physical body, the material side of existence. Flesh, bone, the sense organs, the physical world the senses make contact with. It sounds almost too obvious to need mentioning, but notice immediately that form is not one thing either. It is itself a heap, a collection of physical processes, cells dividing, chemicals exchanging, the entire bewildering machinery of a living body, none of which has a single command center that could be called the form itself. There is no king cell, there is only cooperation, and cooperation is not the same thing as a unified essence. The second heap is feeling, or sensation, vedana. Every moment of experience the tradition claims comes tagged with a basic tone: pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. This is more fundamental than emotion in the usual sense. It is the raw yes, no, or shrug that accompanies every single sensory contact, before you have even had time to think a thought about it. You touch something hot. There is an unpleasant tone before there is a concept of burn or a decision to pull your hand back. The third heap is perception, or recognition, samna. This is the heap that takes raw sensation and slaps a label on it. This shape is a chair. This sound is my mother's voice. This smell is smoke, possibly dangerous. Perception is where the mind starts constructing a world of identifiable objects out of raw sensory static. And it is also, not coincidentally, where most of our assumptions and biases quietly slip in. Because recognition depends on memory, and memory is never neutral. The fourth heap is mental formations, sometimes called volitional formations or fabrications, samskara. This is the largest and messiest category, including intention, will, attention, the emotions in the fuller sense, and habitual tendencies, the entire machinery of reaction and choice. This is the heap most directly tied to karma, because karma, in the technical Buddhist sense, is fundamentally about intention, the volitional push behind an action, not merely the action itself. The fifth heap is consciousness, vijnana. This is bare awareness, the simple fact of cognizing an object, knowing that something is being seen, heard, thought. Crucially, the tradition does not treat consciousness as a single unified light shining continuously through a person's life. It treats consciousness as a series of discrete acts of cognizing, 1% contact, arising and ceasing extremely rapidly, each one dependent on a specific sense organ and a specific object. There is no single continuous consciousness self running underneath all of them like electricity through a wire. There is a rapid sequence of separate cognitive flashes, so fast and so well coordinated that they feel like one continuous beam of awareness, the same way a string of individual film frames feels like one continuous motion picture. Put the 5 heaps together: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, and you have, according to this analysis, the complete inventory of what a person is. Nothing else is required. Crucially, nothing else is found. The tradition's challenge, repeated constantly in the early texts, is direct and almost confrontational. Examine each of these 5 heaps, one at a time, and try to find a self inside any of them. Is the self the body? No. The body changes constantly, gets sick, ages, and eventually stops functioning entirely, while we still feel I persists through all of it. Something that changes that drastically cannot be the unchanging core we assume I to be. Run the same test on feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness, and the same problem appears every time. Whatever you point to is a process, in motion, conditioned by causes, arising and ceasing, not the fixed, independent, command and control I that ordinary experience seems to promise. This is the test the texts call not self. For each heap, ask 3 questions. Is it permanent or impermanent? Is it satisfying, or does it lead to suffering when clung to? Is it under your full independent control, or does it arise and change according to conditions outside your control? In every single case, across all 5 heaps, the honest answer the tradition insists you will arrive at is impermanent, unsatisfying when clung to, not fully under your control, and anything that fits that description, the argument goes, cannot reasonably be called self in the sense people actually mean when they say I. Something stable, something that is truly mine, something that obeys me. A drowning man will grab at a snake if nothing else is within reach, and that is, in a sense, exactly what the ordinary mind does with the 5 heaps. It grabs at form and calls it my body. It grabs at feeling and calls it my mood. It grabs at consciousness and calls it my awareness, the real me behind the eyes. Each grab feels necessary, even life-saving, in the moment. But what is being grabbed is not solid ground. It is a snake, moving, alive in its own right, with its own agenda, and not actually a thing that will hold you up. This is the soil out of which the Abhidharma project grew, The early texts gave the 5-heap analysis, a powerful but still relatively broad map of the person. The later Abhidharma scholars looked at that map and asked an obsessive question: can we go further? Can each of these 5 heaps itself be broken down into smaller, truly basic units? Units so small, so momentary, that they cannot be analyzed any further, the philosophical equivalent of atoms. That question, pursued for centuries by careful, argumentative monks across India, eventually produced the list this video is named for: 75 dharmas. Before we reach the list itself, we need one more piece of groundwork, because the whole project depends on an assumption about time that is at least as strange as the no-self doctrine, the claim that nothing, anywhere, ever lasts longer than an instant. There is a saying, attributed in the Western tradition to the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, that you cannot step into the same river twice, because by the time your second foot touches the water that touched your first foot is already gone downstream, replaced by entirely new water. The river looks like one continuous thing. It is in fact a different river every instant, held together only by a consistent pattern and a shared name. Buddhist philosophy independently arrived at a version of this idea and pushed it further than Heraclitus ever did, applying it not just to rivers, but to everything that exists, including thought itself, including the very mind doing the analyzing. This is the doctrine of momentariness, Kshanikavada, and it is the second pillar alongside no self that the entire Abhidharma system rests on. The claim is this: nothing in conditioned existence lasts. Not for a second, not for any ordinary fraction of a second. Every phenomenon arises, exists for one indivisible moment, and ceases, immediately giving rise to, or being replaced by, the next moment in a causally connected stream. A moment here, a kshana, is not a unit you could measure on a clock. Various Abhidharma texts argue about exactly how many of these arise within the snap of a finger, and the numbers given are absurdly large. But the precise figure matters less than the principle. Existence is not a continuous flow the way water seems to flow. Existence is a string of discrete frames, each one complete in itself, each one gone the instant it appears, replaced by a causally connected successor. If you sit with this for a moment, and this video is built for exactly that kind of sitting, the implications multiply quickly. The chair you are imagining right now is not one persisting object. It is a rapid sequence of chair moments, each one causing the next, similar enough that we perceive continuity, but never literally the same chair twice. The thought you just had is not a single mental event lasting several seconds. It is a rapid sequence of mind moments, each one a complete unit, arising and vanishing, handing off to the next like a relay race with an almost infinite number of runners. And the self, the I already being dismantled in the previous chapters, fares no better under this lens. There is no continuous you lasting from the beginning of this video to this exact sentence. There is a causally connected stream of mind moments, each one conditioned by the one before it, none of them identical, all of them connected. What you experience as a continuous me watching this video is, on this account, exactly as constructed as the continuous river or the continuous motion picture. Real as a pattern, illusory as a single lasting thing. Look at the tracks of your own moccasins. The old saying goes, before judging anyone else's path. And if you genuinely look at the tracks of your own mind, moment to moment, the tradition argues you will not find a single walker. You will find footprints, one after another, each one slightly different, each one gone the instant it is made, with nothing standing still long enough to be called the one who walks. It is worth pointing out how seriously and how literally this doctrine was taken by the schools that built on it, because it is tempting for a modern listener to treat momentariness as a poetic exaggeration rather than a load-bearing technical claim. The later Abhidharma scholastics built entire arguments around exactly how a momentary event can still produce a causal effect in the very next moment if it has already, by definition, ceased to exist by the time that effect occurs. This turned into one of the genuinely hardest problems in the whole tradition, and different schools solved it in sharply different ways. A disagreement we will spend real time on in a few chapters, once the basic 75-item map is fully on the table. Because the disagreement is really a disagreement about how far you are willing to take the demolition of solid, persisting things. Why does momentariness matter for everything that follows? Because it changes the entire question the Abhidharma philosophers were trying to answer. If everything is momentary, then a coherent account of a person, of moral responsibility, of memory, of personality, of rebirth, cannot rely on some underlying permanent thing that persists and experiences all these moments. It has to be built entirely out of causal connections between momentary events, this moment causing that moment, which causes the next, in long branching, interweaving chains, with no single thread running through the middle holding everything together like a string through beads. This is an enormous engineering problem, in the most literal sense. If you remove the permanent self as the explanatory glue, you need some other glue to explain why a person seems coherent over a lifetime, why actions have consequences for the same person later, why memory works at all, why a child grows into a recognizable adult rather than a random sequence of unrelated mind moments with no continuity whatsoever. The Abhidharma scholars spent centuries on exactly this engineering problem. Their solution involved getting extremely precise about what, exactly, exists at each momentary instant, and how those momentary existents are causally connected to each other. That precision is what produced the 75 dharmas. We are finally ready to look at them directly, but first we need to understand what the word dharma is even doing in this technical sense, because it is doing something quite different from how the word gets used in casual conversation about yoga studios and self-help books. The word dharma carries an enormous amount of baggage by the time it reaches an English-speaking audience. It can mean cosmic law, duty, righteousness, the Buddhist teaching as a whole, or simply the way things are. In the specific technical context of the Abhidharma, though, dharma means something much narrower and much stranger. A basic, momentary, irreducible factor of experience. Think of it the way a chemist thinks of an element. You can break a glass of water down into hydrogen and oxygen, but you cannot meaningfully break hydrogen down any further and still be talking about chemistry in the same sense. Hydrogen is, for chemical purposes, basic. The Abhidharmikas were attempting something structurally similar for the entire field of conscious experience. They wanted to identify the smallest possible units of experience stuff, the irreducible elements that combine in different patterns to produce everything a person ever does, thinks, feels, or perceives. The way a relatively small number of chemical elements combine to produce the entire bewildering variety of substances in the physical world. A dharma, in this technical sense, has to meet a fairly strict set of conditions to qualify. It has to have its own intrinsic, identifiable nature, svabhava. Something that distinguishes it clearly from every other dharma, the way blue is distinguishable from loud. It has to be momentary, arising and ceasing within a single kshana, never lasting. And critically, for most schools, it has to be something you cannot break down further into component parts without losing the thing you are trying to describe, unlike a chariot or a person, which dissolve into their parts the moment you start analyzing them. This is precisely the criterion the chariot argument was building toward all along. Chariot fails the test. It is a useful label for an arrangement of parts, not a basic element. Wheel might still fail the test too, if you can break it down into wood fibers and shape and function. But somewhere, the Abhidharmikas insisted the breaking down has to bottom out. Somewhere you reach factors that genuinely cannot be analyzed any further without simply destroying the description. Those bottom-level factors are the dharmas. Everything else, chariots, persons, nations, rivers, selves, is what the tradition calls a conventional or designated reality, panyati, useful and even necessary for everyday language and ethics, but not, in the strict philosophical sense, ultimately real the way a dharma is ultimately real. This produces one of the more philosophically elegant ideas to come out of the entire tradition: the distinction between two levels of truth, conventional truth and ultimate truth. At the conventional level, it is perfectly true and perfectly useful to say, Nagasena walked into the room, or I am sad today, or this chariot is fast. These statements work. They describe real patterns. Nobody is required to abandon ordinary language just because it does not match the deepest level of analysis. At the ultimate level, though, what is actually happening when Nagasena walks into the room is an extraordinarily complex, rapidly shifting configuration of dharmas. Physical dharmas, sensory dharmas, mental dharmas, arising and ceasing in causal sequence, with Nagasena and walking and room all being convenient labels stretched across that underlying flux. If you have something worth saying, the old phrase goes, stand up so you can be seen. And the Abhidharma tradition's entire project was an attempt to stand up and say, with total precision, exactly what is there when you strip away every convenient label. The Sarvastivada school, one of the major early branches of this analysis, and the school whose count this entire video is named after, eventually arrived at a definitive list. 75 fundamental dharmas, organized into careful categories, intended to be a complete and exhaustive inventory of every basic factor that can ever arise in experience. Nothing extra, nothing left out, no soul hiding in the gaps. The Theravada tradition, working somewhat independently in a different region, arrived at a structurally similar but numerically different list. 82 dharmas in its classic formulation, sometimes elaborated into vastly larger numbers in certain technical sub-analyses. The differences between schools matter enormously to specialists, and we will spend an entire later chapter on exactly why they disagreed. What matters here is the shared ambition to replace the vague, comforting word self with a precise, falsifiable, exhaustive map of what is actually there. We are about to walk through that map. It divides first into two enormous territories, the conditioned and the unconditioned, and the conditioned territory itself splits into matter, mind, mental factors, and a strange fifth category of factors that are neither quite physical nor quite mental. Each category answers a slightly different version of the same question. When you remove the self, what is actually doing the work the self was supposed to be doing? Of the 75 dharmas in the classical Sarvastivada list, 72 are called conditioned, Samskrita, meaning they are produced by causes. They exist only because other things cause them to exist, and they will, in turn, cause further things. The remaining 3 are called unconditioned, and we will get to that small, strange category later, because it carries an enormous philosophical weight for its size. The 72 conditioned dharmas are organized into 4 broad groups. The first group is matter, rupa, 11 dharmas covering the physical world, the 5 sense organs, the 5 corresponding sense objects, and a residual category covering subtle physical matter not directly perceptible. The second group is thought itself, citta, just 1 dharma. Somewhat surprisingly, because the Sarvastivada analysis treats mind or consciousness as a single basic factor that always arises together with its various accompanying mental qualities, rather than treating each type of awareness as its own separate dharma, the way the 5 skandha analysis sometimes implies. The third group is the largest by far. 46 mental concomitants, kaita, the various qualities, both wholesome and unwholesome, that accompany and color each moment of awareness. We will spend an entire chapter on this group because it is in a very real sense the tradition's psychology textbook. The fourth group is 14 factors dissociated from thought. Citta viprayukta samskara, a genuinely strange category covering things like the force of life itself, the general characteristic of impermanence, the grouping of words into sentences, and similar abstract, structural features of reality that are neither physical matter nor mental experience in the ordinary sense, but are still treated as real. Basic factors. 11 plus 1 plus 46 plus 14 comes to 72. Add the 3 unconditioned dharmas, and you reach the full 75. What should strike you immediately, looking at this structure, is what is missing. There is no dharma labeled self. There is no dharma labeled person, no dharma labeled owner of experience. The entire architecture of a human life, perceiving, feeling, deciding, suffering, loving, regretting, is built exclusively out of these 72 moving, conditioned pieces, arranged and rearranged at tremendous speed, moment after moment, with no central office anywhere issuing the orders. There is a particular kind of vertigo available here if you actually let it land, rather than treating it as trivia about ancient Indian metaphysics. Consider the physical dharmas first: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, as sense organs; visible form, sound, smell, taste, touch, as sense objects. Notice that eye in this analysis is not your eye, in the sense of belonging to an owner. It is simply a basic physical capacity that, when conditions are right, gives rise to visual consciousness. There is no little person inside the eye looking out through it. There is a causal process. Light strikes a physical organ with the right properties, and visual consciousness arises as a result. The way heat applied to water under the right conditions gives rise to steam. Nobody is doing the seeing in the sense of a hidden controller. Seeing simply happens when the right conditions assemble. This sounds almost mechanical, and in a sense it is meant to. The Abhidharma project has a strong family resemblance to what we would now call a kind of ancient cognitive science or process philosophy, an attempt to explain mental life in terms of impersonal causal mechanisms rather than in terms of an irreducible, mysterious, personal essence. The crucial difference from modern materialist neuroscience is that the Abhidharmikas were not reducing mind to brain matter. Mental dharmas and physical dharmas were both treated as real, both equally basic, interacting through their own causal laws, neither one simply made of the other. It is a dualism of process, not of substance, two different streams of momentary events, tightly coordinated, but neither one a disguised version of the other. What does this do to the question of moral responsibility? The question that keeps surfacing in this video like a stone you keep tripping over on the same path. If seeing is just eye organ dharma plus visible form dharma, giving rise to consciousness dharma, with nobody behind it pulling levers, then where, in this entire mechanical process, does responsibility for action actually live? The answer lives precisely in the third group of dharmas, the 46 mental concomitants, because that is where intention lives. And intention, not some mysterious self, is what the tradition holds responsible for karma. We are about to meet that list directly, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most psychologically sophisticated catalogues of mental states produced anywhere in the ancient world. If the 72 conditioned dharmas are the basic vocabulary of reality, the 46 mental concomitants are where the tradition's analysis becomes recognizably, almost uncomfortably, a description of your own inner life as you are living it right now. The Sarvastivada system organizes these 46 into several functional groups. There are 10 universal mental factors present in literally every single moment of consciousness, no exceptions. Among them sensation, perception, volition, attention, and a handful of other basic cognitive operations that have to be running at all times for any experience to happen at all. There are 10 wholesome factors present specifically in skillful, ethically positive states of mind. Things like faith, diligence, equanimity, non-harming. There are factors specifically tied to defiled or unwholesome states: ignorance, conceit, restlessness, and a particular cluster of factors so persistently troublesome the tradition gives them their own subgroup, centered on greed, hatred, and the confusion underlying both. There are smaller groups covering secondary unwholesome factors like anger, hypocrisy, envy, and stinginess, and a final flexible group of factors that can arise in either wholesome or unwholesome contexts, depending on what else is present, including basic operations like sleep, regret, applied thought, and sustained thought. What this list amounts to, in plain terms, is an exhaustive attempt to catalogue every basic quality a moment of mind can have, the way a color theorist might try to catalogue every basic hue, independent of which particular object happens to be that color at any given moment. Greed is not your greed in this analysis, any more than red is the apple's red in some deep metaphysical sense the apple owns. Greed is a real, basic, conditioned factor that, under certain causal conditions, arises in a particular mind moment, colors that moment, and then ceases, to be followed by whatever the next conditions produce, possibly more greed, possibly its opposite, possibly something else entirely. This reframing has consequences that are genuinely difficult to sit with. And this is exactly the kind of question this channel exists to ask, the one sitting right on the line between good and evil. If anger is not yours, if it is a basic dharma that arises when certain causal conditions assemble, the way rain arises when certain atmospheric conditions assemble, then in what sense are you the author of your own cruelty? In what sense are you the author of your own kindness? The tradition's answer is careful and, in its own way, quite sophisticated. There is no single self behind the anger pulling the strings, but there is still a causal stream, and that causal stream has habits, tendencies, accumulated patterns built up over countless previous moments. What the tradition calls latent dispositions, NEUROSCIENCE, lying dormant in the stream like seeds, ready to sprout into actual anger, actual greed, actual generosity, when the right conditions appear. You did not choose, in some uncaused, sovereign way, to have the dispositions you currently have, but the stream that you call you is still the specific causal continuum in which those dispositions live, and actions taken now plant further seeds that will condition what arises later in that same continuum. This is, in a real sense, a relocation of responsibility rather than an abolition of it. The self as sovereign, uncaused, free-floating decision-maker disappears. What replaces it is a stream of causally connected events with real consequences, real continuity of habit, and real capacity to be reshaped through deliberate practice, which is, after all, the entire point of meditation and ethical training in the Buddhist framework. You cannot blame fate or the universe for your cruelty under this system, any more than you could under a free will framework, because the cruelty arose specifically within your causal stream, conditioned by your own previous moments, your own previous choices, your own previous cultivation or neglect of wholesome factors. But you also cannot treat your anger as some eternal, essential truth about who you really are, because the anger itself is just as impermanent, just as conditioned, just as replaceable as everything else on this list. There is something almost mathematically clean about this picture once you see it clearly. 46 possible qualities of mind, combining in different proportions moment by moment, the way a small number of musical notes combine into an unlimited variety of melodies. No melody requires a hidden composer living inside the piano. It requires the right notes, struck in the right sequence, under the right conditions. A human personality, on this analysis, is not a fixed essence. It is closer to a habitual melody, a pattern that recurs, because the same conditions keep recurring, the same seeds keep sprouting, not because some unchanging self insists on playing the same tune every time out of an unchangeable nature. This is also, not coincidentally, close to where Western psychology eventually arrived through an entirely different route. The recognition that personality traits behave more like statistical tendencies in behavior across situations than like fixed essences, and that even deeply ingrained habits can, under the right conditions of training and repetition, be reshaped. The Abhidharma tradition got there roughly 2,000 years earlier, working from meditation and philosophical analysis rather than controlled experiments, and it built the insight directly into the architecture of its list of basic mental factors. Before we leave the mental side of the ledger, we still owe equal time to the physical side, the 11 dharmas of matter, because the tradition is just as uncompromising about dissolving the solid, dependable physical body as it is about dissolving the mind. It is tempting to assume that even if the mind dissolves under this kind of analysis, the body at least stays solid. Bone is bone, flesh is flesh. Surely there is something dependably physical underneath all this talk of momentary mental events. The Abhidharma tradition disagrees, and its treatment of matter is, if anything, even more austere than its treatment of mind. The 11 physical dharmas consist of 5 sense organs and 5 sense objects, plus one residual category of subtle, non-perceptible matter. The five sense organs are not the gross visible eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body you would point to in a mirror. They are treated as a kind of subtle, specifically receptive physical capacity located within the gross organ, the actual functioning sensitivity that allows, say, the eye to register light, distinct from the surrounding flesh and bone that merely houses that sensitivity. The five sense objects are visible form, sound, smell, taste, and tactile sensation, the specific physical qualities capable of being registered by the corresponding sense. Notice, again, what is conspicuously absent. There is no dharma for the body as a unified, lasting object. There is no dharma for a person's face, a chariot, or a river. Those remain conventional designations, useful labels stretched across rapidly arising and ceasing configurations of the genuinely basic physical dharmas. Your body on this analysis is not one persisting physical thing slowly aging across decades. It is an almost incomprehensibly fast sequence of physical dharma moments, each one causally connected to the last, similar enough in pattern that the label body remains useful from one moment to the next, but never, even for an instant, the literally identical thing. This produces a strange and genuinely useful parallel between the chapter on matter and the chapter on mind that came before it. Both halves of a human being, the physical half and the mental half, turn out, under this kind of analysis, to be made of the same basic kind of stuff: momentary, conditioned, causally connected events, organized by pattern rather than held together by any essential core. The body is not a stable platform on which an unstable mind happens to sit. Both are equally unstable, equally momentary, equally without an essential core, running in parallel causal streams that are tightly coordinated with each other but never literally fused into one substance. There is an old teaching image that fits here surprisingly well, even though it comes from outside this specific tradition. The soul would have no rainbow if the eyes had never known tears, the saying goes, meaning that the beauty and depth available to a mind are inseparable from its capacity to suffer, to be moved, to be conditioned by what happens to it. The Abhidharma's physical and mental dharmas work the same way. Neither half of the picture is more really you than the other, and neither half offers a stable place to hide from impermanence. The body cannot serve as evidence of a permanent self any more than the mind can, because the body too is dissolved by the same momentary analysis, the moment you look closely enough. This is, again, where the question on the edge of good and evil resurfaces, this time wearing a slightly different costume. If your body is not one persisting thing, but a rapid sequence of conditioned physical events, what exactly is harmed when someone harms you physically? The tradition's answer is not that physical harm stops mattering. Quite the opposite. Buddhist ethics treats causing physical suffering as a serious matter precisely because suffering, Vedana, is real and immediate within each moment it occurs, regardless of whether a permanent self is present to own that suffering. The argument is not that pain does not matter because no permanent self feels it. The argument is closer to the reverse. Pain matters intensely, precisely as it occurs in each momentary instance, and that immediate vivid reality of suffering does not actually require a permanent self to back it up. You do not need a soul to make cruelty wrong. The suffering itself, occurring in the present moment within a causal stream, is sufficient grounds for cruelty to be wrong. This is one of the more quietly radical ethical implications buried inside this entire metaphysical project, and we will return to it directly once a few more pieces of the puzzle are on the table. For now, with both matter and the bulk of mind accounted for, only one strange, small, but enormously important category remains among the conditioned dharmas: the 14 factors dissociated from thought, things that are neither quite mental nor quite physical, including, among others, the basic force that keeps a living stream of causal events running as a coherent life at all, rather than simply scattering into unrelated fragments. And beyond even that category lies the smallest and most philosophically loaded group on the entire list: the 3 unconditioned dharmas, the only things in this entire system that the tradition claims do not arise, do not cease, and are not produced by causes at all. Everything we have examined so far belongs to the conditioned category, samskrita, arising from causes, lasting one momentary instant, ceasing, giving way to a successor. 72 of the 75 dharmas fall into this restless, impermanent category. But the classical Sarvastivada list reserves a small, separate space for exactly 3 dharmas that are different in kind. The unconditioned, asamskrita. The first unconditioned dharma is space, akasha, not space in the modern physics sense of a measurable dimension, but a kind of basic, unobstructed absence that does not arise or cease the way physical events do. It is simply there, as a permanent backdrop, never produced, never destroyed. The second and third are 2 distinct states of cessation, 2 different technical descriptions of the complete stopping of certain mental processes, treated as genuinely real, permanent attainments rather than mere absences, one achieved through specific meditative attainment, the other associated with full liberation, nirvana itself, in certain formulations within this particular school's framework. This is a remarkable place for the entire system to land, and it deserves real attention rather than a quick pass-through. After 8 relentless chapters, in effect, of dissolving everything, body, mind, self, chariot, river, person, into momentary, conditioned, causally produced flux, the tradition stops and says, but not everything is like this. There exist a small number of genuinely unconditioned realities, things that do not arise and cease the way everything else does, things that are simply, permanently, unchangingly the case. Different Buddhist schools argued fiercely about exactly what belongs in this category and how literally to take the claim that anything is truly unconditioned. The Theravada tradition restricts the unconditioned category to a single item, nirvana itself, treating space as merely conceptual rather than ultimately real, and arguing that the Sarvastivada's more generous 3-item list grants too much metaphysical solidity to things that should remain provisional. This disagreement matters because it is really an argument about how far the dissolving project should go. If you dissolve absolutely everything, including the possibility of any stable, unconditioned reality at all, you risk a kind of philosophical vertigo with no floor anywhere beneath it, a position some later schools, particularly certain interpretations associated with emptiness philosophy, were willing to embrace fully, arguing that even dharmas themselves, even the basic building blocks, are ultimately without fixed, independent essence. If you keep a small handful of genuinely unconditioned realities, you preserve at least one stable reference point. Most importantly, nirvana, the cessation of suffering itself. That is not simply one more impermanent, conditioned event, destined to arise and pass away like everything else. This is, in its own quiet way, one of the most emotionally important moves in the entire system. And it answers a question that has probably been building across the last several chapters. If literally everything is impermanent, conditioned, and without essential self, what, if anything, is actually being aimed at? What is the point of all this dissolving? The unconditioned dharmas are the tradition's answer. Nirvana, on this account, is not simply a really good momentary mental state that arises and then, like everything else, immediately ceases, leaving you exactly where you started. Nirvana, for the Sarvastivada at least, is treated as a genuinely stable, unconditioned attainment, something you can step into, and that does not, having been reached, simply evaporate the way ordinary pleasant mind moments evaporate. There are many roads leading to the summit, the old phrase goes, but the view remains the same, and the unconditioned dharmas function, in this system, as exactly that kind of summit, a single, stable, non-arising reality that the entire restless machinery of conditioned dharmas is in the end oriented toward escaping into. Whether you find that satisfying, or whether you find it a slightly inconsistent exception carved into an otherwise ruthlessly consistent system, is a live philosophical debate that occupied Buddhist scholastics for centuries after the original Abhidharma texts were composed. And we are about to meet the single most important scholastic who tried to settle it, along with the disagreements that ultimately split the tradition apart. Every elaborate intellectual system eventually needs someone to compile it, test it, criticize it, and hand it down in a form later generations can actually study. For the Sarvastivada list of 75 dharmas, that person is Vasubandhu, one of the most consequential philosophers in the entire history of Buddhist thought, and one of the strangest cases of a thinker changing his mind so thoroughly that his earlier and later work feel, on the surface, like the work of two different people. Vasubandhu lived in the 4th or 5th century in the region of Gandhara, in what is now northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, the same general region, centuries later, where the Greco-Bactrian Milinda had once questioned Nagasena. He was trained thoroughly within the Sarvastivada tradition, specifically within its most systematized branch, the Vaibhashika school, named after the great commentarial text, the Mahavibhasha, the Great Commentary, produced by generations of Sarvastivada scholars working out of Kashmir. Vasubandhu's major early work is the Abhidharma Kosha, the Treasury of Abhidharma, a tightly compressed set of verses laying out the entire 75 Dharma system with remarkable precision. Organized topic by topic: the nature of matter, the nature of mind and mental factors, the realms of existence, karma, the latent dispositions, the path to liberation, and the nature of the unconditioned. It became almost immediately the standard textbook for Abhidharma study across the Buddhist world, translated into Chinese and Tibetan, studied for over a millennium afterward, by traditions that had never directly encountered the original Sanskrit Sarvastivada source texts at all. If a modern student wants to learn the 75 Dharma system today, they are more often than not still effectively learning it through Vasubandhu's compressed verses, even when reading a contemporary textbook that never mentions his name directly. Here is the genuinely strange part, the part that makes Vasubandhu such a compelling figure rather than simply a competent systematizer. He did not write the Abhidharma Kosha as a pure believer, defending his own school's position without reservation. He wrote the verses in a relatively neutral, descriptive voice, laying out the official Sarvastivada Vaibhashika position faithfully and clearly, and then wrote an extensive prose commentary on his own verses, the Bhashya, in which he frequently and pointedly criticizes that very position, often siding instead with a rival school called the Sautrantika, those who rely on the sutras, who rejected several of the more metaphysically ambitious Sarvastivada claims. A reader working through the treasury in its full form is, in effect, watching one of the sharpest minds in the entire tradition build an elaborate intellectual structure, and then, in the very next breath, point out exactly where the foundations are cracked. This matters enormously for how we should read the 75 Dharma list this entire video has been built around. It was never received, even within its own tradition, as an uncontested, final word handed down from on high. It was received as a serious, rigorous, but explicitly contestable hypothesis about the ultimate structure of experience. Precisely the kind of claim its own most capable systematizer felt free to interrogate, chapter by chapter, in his own commentary on his own work. There is a particular kind of intellectual honesty in that, a refusal to treat even one's own carefully constructed system as beyond question, that the tradition as a whole, at its best, consistently modeled. Vasubandhu's story does not end with the treasury. Later in his life, by most traditional accounts, he moved decisively away from the Sarvastivada Vaibhashika framework altogether, and became one of the founding figures of an entirely different school, Yogacara, which pushed the demolition of solid, independently existing things even further than the Abhidharma tradition he had spent his early career systematizing, a development significant enough that we will return to it directly in a later chapter, once we have met the rival schools. Vasubandhu was already arguing with inside the pages of his own treasury. If you have something worth saying, stand up so you can be seen, the old phrase advises. And Vasubandhu stood up twice, in two different and partly incompatible philosophical voices, within a single career, and history judged both voices worth preserving, rather than choosing one and discarding the other. That alone should tell you something about how seriously this tradition took the difference between defending a system and actually believing every detail of it. The 75 Dharma list this video keeps returning to was never the only answer on offer, and it did not emerge from peaceful consensus. It emerged from centuries of genuinely sharp, sometimes bitter argument between rival schools, each one accusing the others of smuggling something illegitimate back into the picture. Usually, ironically, something that looked suspiciously like a hidden self, dressed up in more sophisticated philosophical clothing. The Sarvastivada answer was to grant dharmas, sarva asti, everything exists. Specifically, the claim that a dharma exists not only in the present moment, when it is actively functioning, but in some sense across all three times, past, present, and future. This sounds like a strange thing to insist on, but the motivation was a genuine technical problem we touched on a few chapters ago. If a past cause has already, by definition, ceased to exist by the time it produces a present effect, how can a thing that no longer exists still be doing causal work? The Sarvastivada answer was to grant dharmas a kind of permanent underlying existence as substances, even while their active functioning manifestation arises and ceases moment by moment. A dharma's substance, on this view, persists across past, present, and future. Only its functioning, its actual operation as a cause, is confined to the present moment. The Sautrantika school, the rival tradition Vasubandhu increasingly sided with in his own commentary, found this deeply unsatisfying and accused the Sarvastivada of having smuggled a kind of permanence back into the system through the back door. Exactly the kind of permanence the entire momentariness doctrine was supposed to rule out in the first place. If a dharma's substance persists across all three times, the Sautrantikas argued, in what meaningful sense is anything actually impermanent at the deepest level? Doesn't this just relocate the problem of a fixed, enduring self from the level of the person down to the level of the Dharma itself, leaving the original target of the whole demolition project quietly intact, just renamed? The Sautrantikas proposed instead that only present moment dharmas are real in the strict sense. Past and future dharmas are not substances persisting somewhere, but simply causal relations. A present effect inherits influence from a cause that genuinely, completely no longer exists, the way a stretch of riverbank can be shaped by water that has long since flowed away, without that water needing to still exist somewhere to explain the shape it left behind. This is not a minor technical squabble best skipped over by a general audience. It is, in a real sense, the same underlying argument this entire video has been making about the self, fought out one more time at a deeper level of abstraction. Just as ordinary people assume there must be a fixed, persisting self behind the flux of experience to make that experience coherent, the Sarvastivada assumes there must be a fixed, persisting substance behind the flux of momentary dharma functions to make causality coherent. The Sautrantikas applied exactly the same demolition the Abhidharma had already applied to the person, one level deeper, to the dharmas themselves, insisting that causal connection alone, without any persisting substance underneath it, is sufficient to explain continuity, precisely the same move the tradition uses, as we will see in a few chapters, to explain how karma and rebirth can work without a soul. The Theravada tradition, developing largely independently in Sri Lanka and the regions further south and east, took yet another path, arriving at its own list of 82 Dhamma types rather than 75, organizing the conditioned dharmas somewhat differently, and generally aligning more closely with the Sautrantika instinct that nothing exists outside the strict present moment, while developing its own highly distinctive technical vocabulary and its own extensive commentarial tradition, centered on texts like the Abhidharma Sangaha, compiled centuries later as a more accessible summary of the earlier canonical Abhidharma works. Even a dead fish can drift with the current, the old saying notes, almost as a warning, and it is worth pointing out that none of these schools were drifting passively along with received tradition out of mere habit. Each one was actively, sometimes aggressively, defending a specific position against specific objections from specific rivals, in long debate texts that survive to this day, full of the kind of pointed, occasionally exasperated argumentative back and forth that would not feel out of place in a modern academic philosophy seminar. The 75 dharmas were not received passively. They were fought for, line by line, against thinkers who believed, with equal seriousness, that the list was wrong in identifiable, specific ways. What should you take from this? Sitting here listening rather than reading a specialist's footnoted history. Mainly this. The precision and confidence of 75 dharmas as a number can make the whole system sound more settled and uncontroversial than it ever actually was, even within its own tradition. The deepest commitment shared across all these warring schools was not the specific number 75, or 82, or any other count. It was the shared conviction that close, rigorous, unflinching analysis of experience reveals process rather than a fixed self or a fixed substance, no matter how many times you push the analysis one level deeper looking for somewhere that process might finally stop and a solid thing might finally turn up. Every school that pushed the analysis deeper kept finding the same kind of thing at the bottom, more process, never a self, never quite a fully stable substance either, once you pushed hard enough. Here is a problem that should, by this point, feel genuinely urgent rather than abstract. If there is no permanent self, who commits an action and who experiences its consequences? Karma, in ordinary usage, sounds like a kind of cosmic ledger attached to a person. You do something wrong, and you, the same continuous person, eventually suffer for it, possibly even in a future life. But we have just spent 11 chapters systematically dismantling exactly the kind of continuous person, and even the kind of continuous substance underneath that person, this ordinary picture seems to require. So either the Abhidharma tradition has a serious internal contradiction sitting at its center, or it has a more sophisticated account of karma than the popular version suggests. It has the latter. The technical Buddhist definition of karma is narrower and more precise than most casual usage suggests. Karma is, specifically, intention, cetana, one of the 46 mental concomitants discussed earlier, present in any deliberate action. It is not the physical action itself, and it is not some mysterious cosmic force tracking you personally. It is a specific, real, conditioned mental factor that arises in a moment of mind, accompanies a deliberate act, and, crucially, leaves a causal trace in the stream that follows. This causal trace is where the engineering gets genuinely clever, and where the Sarvastivada Sautrantika argument from the previous chapter turns out to matter quite directly in practice. The Sarvastivada and related schools developed the concept of a kind of seed or latent potency planted in the ongoing mental stream by an intentional action, not stored in a self, because there is no self to store it in, but carried forward causally, moment to moment, the way a wave's energy is carried forward through water that is never literally the same water from one moment to the next. The wave moves. The water does not travel with it in the way a casual glance suggests. Similarly, karmic potency moves forward through the causal stream of momentary dharmas, ripening eventually into a corresponding experience, without requiring any single persisting substance to hold it the entire time. The Sautrantikas, suspicious of granting dharmas too much persisting substance to hold it the entire time, different schools propose different specific mechanisms for exactly how this works, without smuggling a hidden self back in through the side door. Some later traditions developed quite elaborate models, including a concept of a foundational, continuously flowing layer of consciousness specifically designed to carry karmic seeds across the gaps that ordinary surface consciousness cannot bridge on its own, particularly the gap of deep sleep or the gap of death itself. The details vary by school and represent some of the most technically intricate philosophy in the entire Buddhist tradition. But the underlying commitment stays constant across nearly all of them. Causal continuity does the work that a permanent self was traditionally assumed to do, and it does this work without ever requiring a permanent self to actually exist. This is, again, exactly the kind of idea that sits right on the line between comfort and unease that this whole video keeps returning to. On one hand, it is a genuine relief. It means you are not eternally, essentially, unchangeably defined by your worst moment. The person who acted cruelly 5 years ago is not, in the strict sense, the literally sane person reading this sentence now. That person's causal stream has been continuously conditioned and reconditioned by countless intervening moments, including, potentially, remorse, growth, and deliberate ethical cultivation. There is no fixed, permanent, bad person, essence, sitting underneath your history, waiting to be exposed as your true self. On the other hand, it is genuinely unsettling in the opposite direction. It means there is no fixed, permanent, good person essence either, sitting safely underneath your history, immune to corruption. The causal stream that produced your kindness yesterday is the same kind of impermanent, conditioned process that could, under different conditions, produce cruelty tomorrow. Nobody gets to coast on an essential good nature any more than anybody is condemned by an essential bad one. Childhood idols now lie in the junkyard of outdated memes, as the old line goes, and in a structurally similar way, the idea of a fixed moral essence, yours or anyone else's, does not survive close inspection under this framework. What survives, instead, is something arguably more demanding, an ongoing causal responsibility, moment by moment, for which seeds get planted and which seeds get allowed to ripen unchecked. You cannot blame an external cosmic self-judge, and you cannot hide behind an internal fixed nature either. There is only the stream, and what you do right now in this specific moment genuinely conditions what arises later in that same stream, a fact that turns out to matter intensely, even in the complete absence of anyone permanent to own the stream from beginning to end. This brings us directly to the single most famous and most difficult question the entire system has to answer. The question every introductory class on Buddhist philosophy eventually arrives at, usually with at least one visibly frustrated student in the room. If there is no permanent self, and karma works through causal continuity rather than a soul carrying a ledger, then what exactly is reborn when this particular body and mind die? Most people, when they first encounter Buddhist teaching on rebirth, assume it must work the way reincarnation works in many other religious frameworks. A soul or some essential spark of personal identity departs one body and travels into a new one, like a passenger changing trains. The Abhidharma tradition explicitly and repeatedly rejects this picture. There is no soul to depart. There is no essential spark of personal identity to travel anywhere. So what then is the tradition actually claiming happens at death? The classical answer relies on exactly the same causal stream model we have been building across the last several chapters, simply extended across the boundary of death the way it is already extended, moment to moment, across the boundary between any two ordinary mind moments during ordinary waking life. Remember the central claim of momentariness. Even within a single apparently continuous human life, there is no single mind moment that literally persists from childhood to old age. There is instead an unbroken causal chain, each moment conditioning the next, none of them identical, all of them connected. The tradition's account of rebirth simply claims that this same kind of causal chain, under the right conditions, does not have to stop at the boundary conventionally called death. The last moment of one life stream conditioned by the accumulated karmic potency built up across that entire lifetime gives rise to a causally connected first moment in a new configuration of physical and mental dharmas. A new life, the way one flame can light a second flame on a fresh candle. This image of one flame lighting another is, in fact, the tradition's own preferred metaphor, and it is worth sitting with carefully because it answers the passenger problem directly. When a flame on one candle lights a flame on a second candle, is the second flame the same flame as the first or a different flame? The honest answer is neither, exactly. Nothing physically traveled from the first candle to the second. No little ball of fire flew across the gap and took up residence in new wax. And yet the second flame is not random or unrelated either. It would not exist in that specific place, at that specific moment, without the first flame as its direct cause. It is connected, but not identical. Continuous, but not the same thing persisting. This is precisely the relationship that tradition claims holds between one life and the next. Not identity and not utter discontinuity, but causal continuity without an identical, persisting substance making the journey. The person reborn is not you in the sense of the same unchanging self continuing on, the way most popular conceptions of reincarnation imagine it. But the person reborn is also not a stranger, with absolutely nothing to do with you, arising from pure coincidence. The new life stream is the direct causal descendant of the old one, shaped by the karmic potency that old stream built up. The way this exact moment of your life right now is the direct causal descendant of the old one, shaped by the karmic potency that old stream built up. The way this exact moment of your life right now is the direct causal descendant of the moment that came immediately before it. Even though, strictly speaking, on the momentariness analysis, that previous moment is already entirely gone. If someone counted all his inner demons, an old phrase warns, certain figures would groan with envy. And in a similar spirit, if you try to count exactly who is supposedly reborn under this analysis, you find there is no single, countable who there at all. Only an unbroken, causally loaded sequence stretching forward, carrying its accumulated tendencies into a new configuration. This is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind without it collapsing back into the more familiar passenger soul picture, and the historical record shows that even within Buddhist philosophy, different schools struggled, argued, and split partly over exactly how to maintain this distinction precisely, without either smuggling a hidden permanent self back in through the side door, or sliding into a position where rebirth becomes meaningless, because absolutely nothing connects one life to the next. One particularly controversial school, the Puggalavada, the personalist tradition, was accused by nearly every other school of having quietly reintroduced a disguised version of the self under the technical label of a person, precisely in order to solve this exact problem more comfortably, a controversy that shows how seriously the tradition policed its own boundary against any reintroduction of a hidden self, even one introduced with the best explanatory intentions. There is a deeply practical dimension hiding underneath all of this technical machinery, and it is worth surfacing directly because it connects back to the ethical stakes this entire video keeps circling. If rebirth worked the way a passenger soul model suggests, then your fundamental moral status, your essential goodness or badness, would be something like a fixed cargo, carried unchanged from life to life, merely relocated into new containers. Under the causal stream model, by contrast, every single moment, in this life specifically, is doing genuine causal work in shaping what kind of stream gets carried forward. There is no fixed cargo sitting safely in storage regardless of what you do. This is precisely why Buddhist ethical practice places such enormous weight on the present moment, on cultivating wholesome mental factors right now, rather than treating moral character as a fixed inheritance to be passively carried into the next life unchanged. The stream is being actively shaped, this instant, by what arises in it. Nobody else, no fixed self included, is doing that shaping work for you, in advance, on your behalf. We have already used the image of one flame lighting a second flame to describe rebirth. But it is worth pausing on this image one more time, because it captures something the entire system has been building toward across every previous chapter. Connection without identity, continuity without a persisting substance, causation without ownership. Consider how strange this idea actually is once you stop treating it as a clever metaphor and start treating it as a literal description of your own life. Right now, moment to moment. Not just across the larger boundary of death. The you reading this sentence is causally connected to, but not strictly identical with, the you who began this video roughly an hour ago. Something has clearly changed. New ideas have been introduced. New associations have formed. A slightly different configuration of mental dharmas has arisen, conditioned by everything that came before it in this specific viewing experience. And yet there is also clearly continuity. You are not a stranger to yourself. You remember starting the video. The causal thread is unbroken even though no single unchanging thing has persisted through the entire hour. This is the flame, lighting the next flame, alighting the next flame, over and over, at a speed far too fast for ordinary attention to track moment by moment, producing the powerful, almost irresistible illusion of one continuous flame burning steadily the entire time. The illusion is not a flaw in your perception that careless people fall into and careful people avoid. The illusion is, according to this tradition, a structural feature of how perception itself works at ordinary speeds. Perception is simply not fast enough, under normal conditions, to register the gaps between successive film frames at a typical projection speed. This raises an obvious and important question. If the illusion of continuity is built into the very speed and structure of ordinary perception, is there any way to actually perceive the gaps directly, rather than merely being told about them through philosophical argument? The tradition's confident answer is yes, and the method is sustained, disciplined attention, meditation, specifically forms of meditation explicitly designed to slow down and sharpen attention to the point where the usual smoothing over effect starts to break down, and the underlying discontinuity becomes, at least to some degree, directly noticeable. We will spend a full chapter on exactly what that practice involves, and what people report when it works. But before we do, it is worth widening the lens considerably, because this exact image, connection without a persisting substance, identity dissolving under analysis into mere causal succession, is not a Buddhist peculiarity that the rest of philosophy quietly ignored. It turned up again, independently, on the other side of the world, in the writings of an 18th-century Scottish skeptic who had almost certainly never heard the word Abhidharma in his life. David Hume, writing in Edinburgh in the 1730s, working from empiricist philosophy rather than meditation, arrived at a conclusion about personal identity that any Sarvastivada Abhidharmika would have found immediately, almost eerily familiar. Hume's method was simple and ruthless. He proposed to actually look, through careful introspection, for the self that philosophers before him had simply assumed must be there, sitting behind experience, the way the Abhidharmikas had proposed to actually look for the self hiding inside the 5 heaps. He reported finding nothing of the kind. Whenever he turned his attention inward, he found only particular perceptions, a sound, a color, a feeling, a thought, each one distinct, each one fleeting, none of them accompanied by any further separate perception of a unified self having all the other perceptions. He never once caught the self itself in the act of catching anything. From this Hume drew a conclusion that reads, almost word for word in spirit, like a Western echo of the CHARIOT argument given to King Melinda many centuries earlier. The mind, he proposed, is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, united by nothing more than certain relations of resemblance and causation that make them feel continuous. The way the parts of a chariot are united by nothing more than a functional arrangement that makes them feel like one object. There is no further, separate, simple, continuous self-thread running through the bundle holding it together from the inside. The feeling of a unified self, Hume argued, is itself just one more mental event, produced by the mind's natural tendency to smooth over gaps and project continuity onto what is, on close inspection, a rapid, ever-changing succession. Hume's own term for this was the bundle theory of the self, a description that should sound directly familiar after everything covered so far in this video, where the Abhidharmikas spoke of 5 heaps, or 75 dharmas, momentarily arising and causally connected. Hume spoke of a bundle of perceptions, momentarily arising and connected by resemblance and causation, where the Abhidharmikas insisted that person is a conventional label for a process rather than an ultimately real, simple substance. Hume insisted that self is a fiction the mind generates, useful and even unavoidable in practice, but without any genuine metaphysical referent corresponding to it underneath ordinary language. There is one quietly fascinating historical detail worth pausing on here. Hume traveled in France for several years while working on related material, and scholars have long noted, without ever finding decisive direct documentary proof, that French Jesuit missionaries returning from Buddhist regions of Asia were actively circulating accounts of Buddhist no-self teaching in European intellectual circles. During roughly the same period, Hume was developing his own position. Whether Hume was influenced by any direct exposure to Buddhist ideas remains a genuinely open historical question that serious scholars continue to debate, rather than a settled fact. But the philosophical convergence itself, regardless of its exact historical cause, is real and striking, and it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence available that the dissolution of the self under close analysis is not merely a cultural artifact of one specific tradition's starting assumptions, but something that keeps showing up, independently, whenever a sufficiently careful thinker actually goes looking. You can lead a camel to water, the old saying notes, but you cannot make it drink, and Hume himself famously found his own conclusion almost impossible to live with outside the philosopher's study. He admitted, in one of the most quoted passages of his own work, that whenever he left his desk, dined with friends, and returned to ordinary life, the vivid, comforting feeling of being a single continuous self reasserted itself completely, and he found himself simply unable to sustain the bundle theory insight as a felt, lived reality, however convincing he found it as an argument. This is again a remarkably close parallel to something the Buddhist tradition itself takes completely seriously: the gap between intellectually accepting an argument against the self and actually, experientially, no longer feeling like a fixed self, a gap the tradition insists only sustained meditative practice, not philosophical argument alone, can actually close. Hume found the argument. He never claimed to have closed the gap. The next chapter belongs to a 20th century philosopher who tried, with remarkable patience, to push considerably further past that gap than Hume ever attempted to go. If David Hume found the bundle theory argument and then retreated from its implications the moment he left his desk, Derek Parfit, the 20th century Oxford philosopher, did something considerably bolder. He built out the full implications of a no-fixed self position in extraordinary technical detail, across several decades of work, and reported that doing so had genuinely, lastingly changed how he experienced his own life in a direction he explicitly described as more peaceful rather than more frightening. Parfit's central argument, developed most fully in his 1984 book, Reasons and Persons, works through a long series of carefully constructed thought experiments specifically designed to put pressure on the intuitive idea that personal identity is a deep, simple, all-or-nothing fact about the world. Imagine, in one of his most famous examples, a teleportation device that destroys your body in one location while creating an atom-for-atom, identical copy in another location, with all your memories and personality intact. Is the person who steps out of the receiving booth you, in the deep sense, or merely someone exactly like you who happens to believe, mistakenly, that they are you? Now imagine a more troubling variant. The original body is not destroyed, but survives alongside the newly created copy. Are there now two of you? If so, which one is the real one? And on what basis could that question even have a determinate answer? Parfit's conclusion, after pursuing dozens of variations on this kind of puzzle with real philosophical rigor, was that personal identity is not the deep, simple, all-or-nothing fact ordinary intuition assumes it to be. What actually matters, he argued, is something he called psychological continuity and connectedness. Overlapping chains of memory, intention, belief, and personality, linking earlier mental states to later ones by degrees, capable of holding more strongly or more weakly, admitting of borderline cases, exactly the way the Buddhist causal stream model of personal continuity already does. There is no further fact, over and above these continuities and connections, that settles identity questions cleanly in every conceivable case, because there is no further, separate self-substance for any such fact to be a fact about. Parfit was explicit, more explicit than almost any other major Western analytic philosopher of his era, about the resemblance between his own conclusion and Buddhist no-self teaching, and he discussed the comparison directly in his own writing, describing his discovery of the parallel with what reads, on the page as genuine intellectual delight rather than mere academic curiosity. He wrote about the relief this view brought him in strikingly personal terms, describing his earlier sense of life as something like being trapped inside a glass tunnel, moving through time accompanied always by the same fixed self, and describing the shift to a reductionist view of personal identity as something like the walls of the tunnel disappearing, leaving him living, he said, in the open air, more concerned with the quality of experience occurring within his life and within other lives generally, and somewhat less gripped by the specific, sharp boundary supposedly separating his own future experiences from everyone else's. This is the same move, in modern analytic philosophical dress, that we already encountered directly from the Abhidharma tradition's own ethical chapter several steps back. The claim that loosening the grip of a fixed personal identity does not collapse ethics, but can actually loosen the artificial, sharp boundary between self-interest and concern for others that ordinarily makes compassion feel like an effort, a stretch, a sacrifice of something properly theirs. If the boundary between you now and you later is already a matter of degree rather than an absolute metaphysical wall, Parfit argued, then the boundary between you and other people, while certainly real at the level of everyday distinctness, starts to look less like the kind of unbridgeable metaphysical chasm that ordinary self-interest assumes it to be. There is a particular pleasure available in seeing this same insight, demolishing the same fixed self, easing the same artificial wall between self-concern and concern for others, arrived at completely independently, 3 separate times across history. By Sarvastivada and Theravada monks working from meditation and rigorous textual analysis in ancient India, by a skeptical Scottish empiricist working from careful introspection in 18th century Edinburgh, and by an analytic philosopher working from formal thought experiments about teleportation and brain-splitting in 20th century Oxford. Different methods, different vocabularies, different historical contexts, no direct line of influence connecting the third figure back to the first 2 in any straightforward way. And yet, when each of them looked closely enough and honestly enough, they kept finding, at the bottom, the same kind of thing. Not a self, a stream, a bundle, a pattern of continuity and connection, convincing as an organizing principle, absent as a separate, simple, persisting substance. This convergence is not, by itself, proof that the no-self view is correct. Convergent error is entirely possible, and serious critics of both Hume and Parfit exist within Western philosophy, arguing in various ways that something about personal identity is being lost or mischaracterized by reductionist accounts of this kind. But the convergence is genuinely difficult to dismiss as mere cultural coincidence. And it sets up the next turn this video needs to take. Because even within the Buddhist tradition itself, the 75 Dharma Abhidharma analysis we have spent most of this video walking through was not the final word. A later movement arose that looked at the entire Dharmalist project, the very apparatus that had been used to dissolve the self, and asked an uncomfortable question. If dissolving the self required showing that person is just a conventional label for a process built out of more basic, more real dharmas, what happens if you apply that exact same kind of scrutiny to the dharmas themselves? The Yogacara school, the tradition Vasubandhu himself eventually moved toward later in his career, after writing his own searching skeptical commentary on the Sarvastivada system in the Abhidharma Kosha, pushed the demolition one full level deeper than the Abhidharma had been willing to go. Recall the basic criterion a dharma was supposed to satisfy in order to qualify as genuinely, ultimately real, rather than merely a conventional label like chariot or person. It had to have its own intrinsic nature, svabhava, something that made it what it was independent of anything else, something that did not dissolve into further parts or further relations the way chariot dissolves into wheels and axle and function. The entire weight of the 75 Dharma system rests on the claim that this criterion is satisfiable, that somewhere the analysis genuinely bottoms out, and you reach factors that really do have this kind of independent, intrinsic, self-standing nature. Yogacara philosophers, Building on related lines of argument already developed within the broader Mahayana emptiness tradition associated with figures like Nagarjuna, pressed hard on exactly this claim and found it wanting. Consider any single dharma on the list, say a basic sensation of blue. Does this sensation, examined honestly and rigorously, actually have a fully independent, self-standing nature, the way the criterion requires? Or does it too turn out to depend entirely on relations to other things, on a perceiving consciousness to register it, on causal conditions that produced it, on contrast with other colors that give blue its specific identifiable character at all? If a basic dharma turns out, on close inspection, to be just as dependent, just as relational, just as lacking in independent self-standing nature as a chariot or a person, then the entire distinction between ultimately real dharmas and merely conventional persons starts to collapse from underneath. And the demolition has to go one level further than the Abhidharma itself was willing to take it. This is the doctrine of emptiness, shunyata, applied specifically and rigorously to the dharmas themselves, not merely to persons and chariots. Where the Abhidharma had used the analysis of dharmas as the tool to dissolve the illusion of a fixed self, the later Madhyamaka and Yogacara traditions turned the same tool on the dharma analysis itself, arguing that even the supposedly basic, irreducible building blocks of the 75-item list lack the kind of independent, self-standing existence the system needed them to have, and are themselves, in the deepest sense, empty of fixed essence, dependent for whatever reality they have on relations, causes and conditions all the way down, with no bottom level of genuinely independent things ever actually reached. Yogacara specifically added a further distinctive twist of its own, arguing that the apparent external world encountered through the dharmas is itself best understood as a kind of construction or projection of consciousness, rather than as something straightforwardly external and independent that consciousness simply registers from the outside. A much more radical, idealist-leaning position than anything the Sarvastivada Abhidharma had committed to, and one that brought Buddhist philosophy into territory with intriguing, much later parallels in certain strands of Western idealist philosophy, developed entirely independently centuries afterward. There are many roads leading to the summit, the old phrase observes, but the view remains the same. And it is worth being honest about exactly what kind of summit the Yogacara critique reaches, because it is genuinely more radical and more vertiginous than the relatively more grounded Abhidharma analysis this video has spent most of its time on. The Abhidharma offers you a floor, even if that floor consists entirely of fast, impersonal, momentary process, rather than a fixed self. 75 real, basic, irreducible factors, genuinely there, genuinely doing causal work. The later emptiness traditions, including Yogacara, suggest there may be no flaw at all in that sense. Only relation, dependency, and construction, all the way down, with even the dharmas themselves ultimately failing to provide the kind of independent, self-standing bedrock the earlier system needed. This video has deliberately stayed mostly within the more conservative, more structurally legible Abhidharma framework throughout. Precisely because it gives a concrete, examinable list to work with, rather than asking you to hold an infinite regress of dependency in your head with nothing solid anywhere to land on. But it would be dishonest to leave you with the impression that the 75 dharmas were Buddhist philosophy's final, settled answer to the question of what is ultimately real. Within the tradition itself, they were one stop on a longer road, a road that kept demanding the same uncomfortable, productive question be asked again. One level deeper, every time a thinker found something that looked, even slightly, too solid, too independent, too much like a fixed thing standing still. It would be a strange omission, after 2,500 years of careful philosophical demolition work across two completely separate traditions, not to ask what happens when you point modern neuroscience at exactly the same question, using brain imaging and clinical observation instead of meditation or thought experiments about teleportation. The honest, current answer is that neuroscience has not found a self either in the sense of a single unified brain structure or process that functions as a central command center, a little operator sitting behind everything else, integrating all experience from one fixed vantage point, the way the folk picture of the self assumes. What neuroscience has found, again and again, across many different lines of investigation, looks considerably more like the Abhidharma picture than like the folk picture, a highly distributed, constantly shifting, causally interconnected set of processes that, under specific conditions, produces a strong, vivid, and remarkably convincing impression of unity, without that impression corresponding to any single underlying unified thing. Split brain research, studying patients whose corpus callosum, the thick bundle of fibers connecting the two hemispheres, has been surgically severed, typically as a last resort treatment for severe epilepsy, has produced some of the most directly startling evidence along these lines. Under carefully controlled experimental conditions, the two hemispheres of a split brain patient can be shown information independently and can sometimes generate what look like two somewhat independent streams of decision-making and response, occurring within what remains, from the outside into the patient's own ordinary report. One single person living one single life. This does not mean split brain patients have two selves in any simple sense, and the patients themselves do not typically report feeling divided in ordinary daily life. But the research does demonstrate, in a startlingly concrete way, that the felt sense of a single, unified central experiencer is not strictly guaranteed by the underlying architecture, and can be partially dissociated under the right conditions. Evidence against, rather than for, the idea of a single simple thing doing all the unifying work. Research on confabulation tells a related story from a different angle. Patients and, importantly, healthy research subjects under specific experimental manipulations have repeatedly been shown to generate confident, detailed, entirely sincere explanations for actions or choices that demonstrably were not the actual cause of those actions. The explaining mind constructs a plausible story after the fact and presents it with full subjective conviction as though it had been present and operative at the moment of decision. This directly echoes the Abhidharma's own analysis of perception, samajna, as a labeling, narrativizing process that constructs a coherent story out of more basic events, frequently well after those events have already occurred, rather than transparently reporting on something a unified self consciously decided in real time. Memory research adds a further, independently converging line of evidence. Decades of careful experimental work have established that human memory is fundamentally reconstructive rather than simply reproductive. Each act of remembering actively rebuilds a memory from fragments, rather than replaying a stored fixed recording, and this reconstructive process is demonstrably susceptible to distortion, suggestion, and even outright confident fabrication of detailed memories for events that never occurred at all. If the sense of being a continuous self persisting across a lifetime depends substantially on a continuous, reliable autobiographical memory connecting past selves to the present one, and that memory turns out to be actively reconstructed and not infrequently inaccurate, the foundation for that felt continuity looks considerably less solid than ordinary intuition assumes. More recent theoretical work in cognitive science, particularly approaches grouped under the label of predictive processing, has gone further still, modeling the brain's basic operation not as passively receiving and unifying sensory information under the direction of a central self, but as continuously generating predictions about incoming sensory data and continuously updating those predictions based on prediction error. A picture of mind as an ongoing, layered, distributed process of active modeling, strikingly closer in spirit to the Abhidharma's analysis of momentary, causally connected dharmas arising and ceasing in rapid succession than to the folk picture of a single, stable self quietly observing a stable world from a fixed vantage point. None of this constitutes definitive proof of the specific Buddhist metaphysical claims explored throughout this video. Neuroscience operates with its own assumptions, its own open questions, and its own ongoing internal disagreements about how to interpret exactly these findings. And serious caution is warranted before treating any specific brain imaging result as settling a 2,500-year-old philosophical debate. but the general direction of travel across an enormous and otherwise unrelated body of modern empirical research keeps landing in roughly the same neighborhood that ancient Indian monks reached through meditation and argument, that a Scottish empiricist reached through careful introspection, and that a 20th century Oxford philosopher reached through formal thought experiments. Wherever you look closely and carefully enough for a single, simple, unified, persisting self, you find, instead, process, construction, and connection. Convincing as a felt pattern, conspicuously absent as a discoverable thing. This sets up the final practical turn this video has been building toward across 18 chapters of argument, history, and converging evidence. If careful analysis from every direction tried so far keeps failing to locate a fixed self, is there a way to actually experience that absence directly, rather than simply accepting it as a well-supported conclusion? The Buddhist tradition's confident answer, as we touched on briefly several chapters back, is meditation, and it is worth now walking through, in real detail, what that practice actually involves, and what practitioners across many centuries have consistently reported when it begins to work. It would be a mistake to think of Buddhist meditation, in this specific Abhidharma-influenced context, as primarily about relaxation, stress reduction, or achieving a pleasant, calm mental state. Those effects can and often do occur as side benefits, and modern secular mindfulness programs have understandably emphasized them, since they translate easily into measurable well-being outcomes. But the specific analytical meditation associated with the Abhidharma tradition has a more demanding and, frankly, more unsettling primary goal: the direct, experiential dismantling of the sense of a continuous self, using the very categories of the Dharma analysis as a working tool. A meditator trained in this tradition is taught to apply something close to the chariot argument, but turned inward and applied moment by moment to live experience, rather than to a chariot sitting in front of a king. Notice a sensation arising. Do not simply react to it, label it, and move on the way ordinary attention does almost instantly and automatically. Instead, hold attention steady on it, long enough to notice its arising, its brief duration, and its ceasing, as a discrete event. Then notice the next moment, and the next, attempting to catch, directly, the gaps that ordinary perception smooths over by default. The aim is not to think about impermanence as an abstract philosophical doctrine you have accepted on argument or authority. The aim is to directly witness impermanence happening, repeatedly, in your own stream of experience, until the witnessing itself becomes more convincing than any argument could ever be. Traditional accounts of this practice, particularly within the more systematized Theravada meditation manuals that grew up alongside and after the canonical Abhidharma texts, describe a fairly specific, gradual progression that is worth walking through in some detail, because it directly maps the abstract categories covered earlier in this video onto a concrete lived training sequence. Early stages typically focus on simply stabilizing attention on a single, repeated object, often the physical sensation of breathing, training the mind to notice when it has wandered and to return, again and again, without harshness or self-criticism, gradually building the kind of sustained, steady attentional capacity that the later, more demanding analytical stages will require. This stabilizing work is not a mere warm-up to be rushed through. Traditional teachers consistently warn that attempting the more advanced analytical dismantling without first building this kind of steady foundation tends to produce confusion, anxiety, or a kind of intellectualized, merely conceptual version of insight, rather than the direct, settled experiential kind the practice is actually aiming at. Once attention is reasonably stable, the practice typically shifts toward direct, moment-by-moment noting of whatever arises in experience. A sensation, a sound, a thought, an itch. A feeling tone of pleasant or unpleasant or neutral, each one noted as it occurs and then released as the next moment's experience arises in its place. Over extended, repeated practice, practitioners across many different lineages and many different centuries report a broadly similar shift. The felt texture of experience starts to change from a single, smooth, continuous stream into something closer to a rapid series of discrete events, each one arising and passing with a clarity that simply was not available to ordinary unexamined attention. This is, in effect, the direct experiential correlate of the momentariness doctrine covered several chapters back. Not an argument accepted on authority, but something closer to a directly noticed feature of one's own ongoing experience. The way you might come to directly notice flicker in a light source that initially looked perfectly steady, once your attention becomes sharp and stable enough to catch the gaps. This kind of practice produces, according to a very large and historically consistent body of first-person testimony across many centuries and many different teachers, a particular and often quite disorienting experience sometimes referred to as the dissolution of the sense of a unified observer. Practitioners describe moments in which the usual feeling of, "I am here, watching this experience happen to me," becomes strangely thin, almost detachable from the experience itself, as though the watching and the watched were not, after all, two separate things requiring a separate watcher to connect them, but were simply different aspects of the same arising and ceasing process. This is not always described as a pleasant experience, and the tradition itself is quite honest about this, refusing to oversell the early stages of this kind of practice as uniformly blissful. Traditional maps of meditative progress, particularly within certain Theravada lineages, explicitly describe a phase sometimes translated as knowledge of dissolution, followed by a genuinely difficult phase sometimes translated as knowledge of fear or knowledge of misery, in which the loosening grip of the ordinary sense of a continuous, stable self can produce real disorientation, even something resembling acute anxiety, precisely because the usual, comforting feeling of being a continuous, stable watcher behind experience starts to genuinely loosen rather than remaining a purely intellectual idea entertained at a safe distance. This makes sense, given everything we have covered. If your entire sense of safety, continuity, and meaning has been quietly built, your whole life, on an assumption the meditation is specifically designed to undermine, then watching that assumption actually weaken in real time, rather than merely reading an argument against it, would reasonably be expected to feel destabilizing before it feels liberating, if it ever does feel liberating at all. There are many ways to smell like a skunk. The old saying goes, meaning there is more than one route to an unpleasant outcome. And the tradition is quite clear that this kind of analytical dismantling, undertaken carelessly, without proper guidance, ethical grounding, and gradual preparation, can indeed produce genuine psychological distress, rather than insight. This is precisely why traditional training places such heavy emphasis on ethical conduct and on building a stable foundation of concentration, before attempting the more advanced stages of analytical, dismantling style meditation. The demolition is meant to be controlled, structural, and purposeful, like an engineered implosion that brings down exactly the right wall, in exactly the right way, not a careless explosion that takes out the load-bearing structure of someone's basic psychological stability, along with the illusion it was actually targeting. What, then, is supposed to remain after the demolition, if anything? The tradition's answer circles back directly to the unconditioned dharmas discussed several chapters ago. What remains, ideally, is not nothingness, and not a more refined version of the same sense of a continuous personal self merely relocated to a subtler level. What remains, according to the tradition, is something closer to a direct, ongoing recognition of process itself. Experience continuing to happen, vividly, even movingly, without requiring a fixed self standing behind it to make that experience meaningful or valid. This is, by the tradition's own account, an extremely difficult state to describe in ordinary language, precisely because ordinary language is saturated, at every level, with the assumption of a continuous self doing the describing. But it is worth noting, before we move to the ethical implications directly, that this is explicitly offered as a description of relief, not despair, closer, in fact, to the precise feeling Derek Parfit described several chapters back, of walls disappearing and the open air arriving in their place, than to the loss of something precious that should have been protected. This sets up the final, and, in many ways, most important question this entire video has been building toward from its very first sentence. If there really is no fixed self doing the suffering, doing the wronging, deserving the blame or the credit, what happens to ethics? Does morality survive the demolition, or does it collapse along with the self it was apparently designed to protect? This is the question that sits most precisely on the line between good and evil that this video has promised from the beginning, and it deserves to be taken completely seriously rather than waved away with a comforting platitude. Here is the trap, stated as bluntly as possible. If there is no permanent self, then there is no permanent victim who is truly essentially harmed by cruelty, and no permanent wrongdoer who is truly essentially guilty of having caused that harm. Each apparently sounds, at first hearing, like exactly the kind of thing a clever, dangerous person could use to excuse almost anything. If my cruelty 5 minutes from now will be carried out by a slightly different configuration of momentary dharmas than the one sitting here now, conditioned by but not strictly identical to this current me, in what sense am I genuinely deeply accountable for it in advance? If the person I might harm is not, strictly speaking, a single continuous self either, but merely a temporary momentary configuration of dharmas with no essential permanent core to protect, in what sense have I genuinely harmed someone irreplaceable? The early Buddhist tradition was acutely aware of exactly this danger, and it took the question seriously enough to address it directly and repeatedly, rather than dodging it. The core of the response runs roughly as follows, and it is worth following carefully because it is genuinely subtle. The absence of a permanent self does not mean the absence of real causal continuity, and it does not mean the absence of real, vivid, immediate suffering occurring within that continuity at each and every moment it occurs. Suffering does not require a permanent owner to be real suffering. Pain, right now in this specific moment, is fully and completely pain, regardless of whether some permanent metaphysical self stands behind it as its essential owner. Removing the permanent self from the picture does not remove the suffering. It only removes one particular and arguably unnecessary explanation for why that suffering matters. In fact, the tradition argues, in a move that consistently surprises people encountering it for the first time, the no-self doctrine is meant to function as the foundation of compassion rather than its enemy. Consider why ordinarily people draw such a sharp moral line between harm done to themselves and harm done to others. The instinctive answer is something like, my suffering is mine, essentially, intimately, in a way that your suffering, belonging to a separate essential self, simply is not and cannot be to me. But if the sharp boundary between my essential self and your essential self is, on close analysis, an illusion, if both of us are, in the deepest sense, simply causally connected streams of momentary, impersonal events, none of them more essentially mine than the next moment's events are essentially mine, then the foundation for treating your suffering as fundamentally less urgent than my own starts to look considerably weaker than it normally feels. The boundary that ordinarily justifies selfishness, on this analysis, is exactly the same kind of constructed, conventional boundary that the CHARIOT argument dissolved in the very first technical chapter of this video. And exactly the same kind of boundary, Derek Parfit, working from an entirely different direction many centuries later, found loosening his own grip on ordinary self-interest once he had fully absorbed the reductionist view of personal identity. This does not mean the distinction between persons disappears entirely at the conventional level, and the tradition is careful never to claim that it does. You are still, conventionally, responsible specifically for the causal stream that includes your own intentions and actions, not someone else's. The karma framework discussed earlier depends entirely on this kind of causal specificity remaining intact. But the deeper metaphysical claim that there is no essential, permanent difference in kind between your suffering and anyone else's suffering is offered throughout this entire tradition as a direct support for ethical practice, not a loophole around it. Loving kindness and compassion, in classical Buddhist ethical training, are explicitly cultivated by extending the same quality of care you naturally feel toward your own momentary stream of suffering outward, toward other momentary streams of suffering that the no self-analysis reveals to be, at the deepest level, made of fundamentally the same impersonal, causally conditioned stuff. There is still a genuine, unresolved difficulty hiding here, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it rather than pretending the tradition has tied off every loose end. Plenty of careful modern philosophers, both sympathetic to and critical of Buddhist metaphysics, have pointed out that there remains real, ongoing debate about whether the no-self doctrine genuinely strengthens the foundations of ethics the way the tradition claims, or whether it instead leaves those foundations resting on something considerably thinner and more fragile than the traditional language of inherent human dignity and inherent rights typically assumes. If nothing has inherent, essential worth because nothing has an essential, permanent core to begin with, can anything coherently be said to deserve inherent respect, as opposed to a more provisional, conventionally agreed-upon respect that depends on shared practical commitments rather than on metaphysical necessity? This is not a question this video is going to resolve for you, because it has not been definitively resolved by several thousand years of serious philosophical attention from extremely capable thinkers working inside and outside the tradition, including, as we have now seen, thinkers as historically and culturally distant from each other as Vasubandhu, Hume and Parfit, each circling the same difficulty from a different angle. It is offered here precisely because it belongs exactly on the line between good and evil this whole project has promised from its opening sentence, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the seriousness of the material. What we can say with more confidence, heading into the final chapter, is what the tradition itself believed followed practically from taking all of this seriously, not as a topic for academic debate alone, but as something meant to be lived, moment to moment, by an ordinary person trying to suffer less and cause less suffering to others, without the comforting but, on this analysis, ultimately mistaken assumption of a fixed, permanent self standing behind every choice. We began this video with a simple, almost embarrassing question. Who are you? We have spent the time since then taking that question apart with as much precision as a 2,000-year-old philosophical tradition, a skeptical Scottish empiricist, a 20th century Oxford philosopher, and a substantial body of modern neuroscience could collectively bring to bear. And the honest answer, by this point, should feel considerably less simple and considerably more interesting than it did at the start. You are not a fixed essence wearing a temporary body, watching your life unfold from some safe, unchanging vantage point behind the eyes. You are, according to this analysis, a fast, causally connected stream of momentary physical and mental events. 75 basic kinds of building block by one careful ancient accounting, or 82 by another, combining and recombining at a speed far too fast for ordinary attention to track, producing, as an emergent pattern rather than an underlying fact, the powerful and almost universally convincing impression of a continuous person. And even that list of building blocks, as later thinkers within the same tradition went on to argue, may itself dissolve under sufficiently close inspection into nothing but relation and dependency, all the way down. There is a particular kind of practical freedom available in taking this seriously, rather than treating it purely as an interesting historical curiosity from a distant philosophical tradition. If the cruel thing you did, or the cruel thing that was done to you, was carried out by a specific, conditioned configuration of momentary causes, rather than expressing some fixed, essential, unchangeable nature, then neither the guilt nor the grievance has to be treated as permanent and unchangeable either. The stream that produced that moment is not the same stream sitting here now, even though it is causally connected to it. Growth, in this framework, is not a metaphor. It is a literal structural feature of how a causal stream actually works. New conditions genuinely can produce a genuinely different pattern, moment by moment, the way a river genuinely can carve a new channel given enough time and enough changed conditions, without ever requiring a single, unchanging riverbed underneath it all to make that change meaningful. There is also a particular kind of demand buried inside this same freedom, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. If there is no fixed self that will eventually, automatically arrive at goodness on its own, simply by virtue of having a good essential nature, then the cultivation of goodness has nowhere else to come from except the actual, ongoing, moment-to-moment conditioning of the stream you happen to be. Nobody else is doing that work for you, and no fixed inner nature is guaranteed to do it for you either. The flame lighting the next flame is not a passive, automatic process from the point of view of the conditions feeding it. It depends in part on what fuel is actually available to be lit, moment by moment, and that fuel, in the specific case of a human mind, is built substantially out of habits, attention, and intention, all of which are, by this tradition's own careful accounting, genuinely within the realm of what can be deliberately shaped. Life flows from within outward. An old teaching observes, follow that thought all the way through, and you arrive at something close to the truth itself. And the Abhidharma tradition's version of that same insight, echoed across an ocean and several centuries by a Scottish skeptic, looking inward for a self he could never quite catch, and echoed again by an Oxford philosopher who found, on paper, that the walls of his own glass tunnel simply dissolved, is that the flow itself, examined closely enough, turns out to be the only thing that was ever really there. Not a self having a flow of experience, simply the flow, continuous in pattern, discontinuous in substance, real in its causal power, empty of any fixed owner standing behind it. This is, by the tradition's own consistent account, not a tragedy. It is closer to the discovery that you were never required to carry a burden you had quietly assumed your entire life, that you had no choice but to carry. The self you have been so carefully protecting, defending, justifying, and worrying about, across every difficult conversation you have ever had with yourself in the middle of the night, that particular self, the tradition suggests, was never actually load-bearing in the way you assumed. The suffering is real. The causal stream is real. The capacity to change, moment by moment, is real. What was never quite as real as it felt was the fixed, permanent, essential owner you assumed, had to be standing behind all of it, holding it all together, the way you assumed a chariot needed a hidden chariot essence behind its wheels and axle and frame. Look, one more time, at the tracks of your own moccasins. The old saying advises before judging anyone else's path, and perhaps the deepest invitation hiding inside this entire 2,000-year-old project, joined much later by a Scottish empiricist, an Oxford analytic philosopher, and a growing body of careful brain science, is simply this: look closely enough at your own tracks, moment by moment, and see for yourself whether you can actually find the walker the tracks are supposed to belong to, or whether you find instead exactly what the careful monks who built this 75-item list claimed you would find. Footprints, one after another, connected, moving, and, however strange this sounds the first time you really sit with it, nobody walking. If this kind of slow demolition of the obvious is the kind of thing that helps you think, or helps you sleep, a like and a subscription genuinely keeps this channel able to keep doing it. And if there is a tradition, a thinker, or a question from psychology that has been sitting unresolved in the back of your mind, tell us in the comments. We are always looking for the next thing worth taking apart this carefully.